Good evening, I'm Maciej Mikos and you're watching World News Tonight, live from Warsaw. The likely next US Secretary of State says both Moscow and Kyiv need to make concessions to reach a peace deal in Ukraine. Meanwhile, British Prime Minister Keir Starmer has paid a visit to Kyiv to assure the country of his unwavering support. More on that in a moment, but first let's look at the latest headlines. There is still no confirmed ceasefire in Gaza. Israel is reluctant to approve the deal due to a last-minute crisis. The Prime Minister of Vietnam visits Warsaw as Hanoi lifts visa requirements for Polish tourists. And after 4 years and 7 elections, Bulgaria finally has a new government. As the presidential campaign gains momentum in Poland, Warsaw's relationship with Ukraine becomes a major talking point in the upcoming vote. Given the incumbent Polish president's ironclad support for Ukraine's bid to join both the EU and NATO, Kyiv will also seek to develop a strong relationship with the next Polish head of state. Franciszek Pilis has more.
In just a few months' time, Poles will have to choose their next president. Kyiv, which has placed joining the EU and NATO as number one on their list of priorities, has often found an ally to its cause in Poland's incumbent president Andrzej Duda, as well as the current Polish government, which now heads the presidency of the European Council. If Kyiv hopes to join these blocs anytime soon, it will need Warsaw to continue its support no matter who ends up in the presidential palace. The favorite to win the vote is Rafał Trzaskowski, the mayor of Warsaw and a candidate supported by the ruling Civic Coalition. Despite Trzaskowski having a commanding lead in previous months, the runner-up, Karol Nawrocki, supported by Poland's largest opposition party, the right-wing Law and Justice, the same party that promoted Andrzej Duda during his campaign for president, seems to be catching up according to the latest polls, with Trzaskowski projected to secure 35% of support and Nawrocki 31%. Nawrocki's attitude towards Ukraine is skeptical at best, given his statements about the prospect of its accession into the EU and NATO over the issue of the Volhynia massacre.
The issue of the exhumations wasn't as inflammatory a few years ago. It seemed as if it didn't arouse the Polish public much. However, as time passed, news of the Ukrainian side's reluctance to allow for the exhumations, despite receiving so much help from Poland, made it a very important topic in the Polish political discourse.
The Volhynia massacre saw over 100,000 Poles killed by Ukrainian nationalists between 1943 and 1945. For years, Poland was not allowed to exhume the bodies of the victims to give them a proper burial in their homeland, an event in Polish history whose resolution Karol Nawrocki has turned into a condition for Ukraine's accession into the EU and NATO.
I do not see Ukraine in any structure, neither in the European Union nor in NATO, until such important civilization issues for Poles are settled. A country that is unable to account for a very brutal crime against 120,000 of its neighbors cannot be part of international alliances.
According to statements from Polish Prime Minister Donald Tusk, Warsaw and Kyiv have recently reached an agreement which would allow for the exhumation process to begin as early as April this year. Ukraine's president responded to Nawrocki's statement with some harsh words for the Law and Justice candidate.
Mr. Nawrocki should start training because it may turn out that he will have to take up arms to defend his country alongside his fellow citizens. If Ukraine is kept out of Western blocs, the risk of war in Poland will be very high. Right after Ukraine, Russia will be on Poland's border, and then Mr. Nawrocki will have no political competition, but will be fighting for his life.
On the other hand, Rafał Trzaskowski, who is the only candidate to have spoken with President Zelensky during his most recent visit to Warsaw, seems much more receptive to the idea of helping Kyiv join the West once Russian troops leave Ukraine.
Everyone who says Ukraine shouldn't be in NATO is playing right into Putin's hands, because Putin is trying to convince everyone in Europe that Ukraine shouldn't be part of NATO or the EU.
Given how close the race for the presidential palace seems to be, the fate of the relations between Kyiv and Warsaw is still up in the air.
Sacrifices will need to be made. That's according to Republican Senator Marco Rubio, Donald Trump's nominee for Secretary of State, who believes the war between Ukraine and Russia must be brought to a swift end. During his confirmation hearing before the US Senate, the next top American diplomat said that any peace deal would require bold diplomacy. Sasha Farber has more in his report.
Thank you very much, Senator Scott.
During a confirmation hearing, America's potential new chief diplomat, Marco Rubio, offered some insight into Trump's vision of foreign policy. Regarding the war in Ukraine, it appears that Washington will expect concessions to be made from Kyiv as well as Moscow in order to settle the conflict.
What Vladimir Putin has done is unacceptable. There's no doubt about it. But this war has to end by this. But it's going to require bold diplomacy. And my hope is that it could begin with some ceasefire. And we're going to have, in order to achieve objectives like the one that needs to occur in Ukraine, it is important for everyone to be realistic. There will have to be concessions made by the Russian Federation, but also by the Ukrainians, and the United States has lent itself there.
If Rubio expects concessions, this could work in Moscow's favor, meaning that Ukraine would be forced to cede territory for peace. This type of concession would also play into the narrative of the Kremlin, which is that Russia invaded Ukraine due to Kyiv's NATO ambitions. This is one of the many lines the Kremlin has used to justify its continued aggression in Ukraine, and it is a message that seems to have been taken to heart by Donald Trump.
A big part of the problem was Russia for many, many years, long before Putin said you could never have NATO involved with Ukraine. Biden said, no, they should be able to join NATO. Well, then Russia has somebody right on their doorstep, and I could understand their feeling about that.
Despite the Kremlin's revisionist narrative, Ukraine has pointed to historical records and insists that Russia's aggression long predates any ambitions by Ukraine to join the transatlantic alliance.
Russia first invaded Ukraine in February 2014 by occupying the Crimea Peninsula. At that moment, Ukraine was a neutral country by law and expressed no intention of joining NATO whatsoever.
Marco Rubio has made it clear negotiations are on the horizon for the new resident of the White House. However, this is at odds with other NATO allies like Poland, a country that has invested heavily in its own defense and has staunchly defended Kyiv ever since the full-scale invasion in 2022. And the country's president sees NATO as the only viable security guarantee for Kyiv.
Those guarantees can only be granted by countries that belong to the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. And the most important of those guarantees, which I wholeheartedly believe, is Ukraine's future NATO membership and all the security guarantees associated with it, including those regarding NATO's Article 5.
British Prime Minister Keir Starmer's visit to Kyiv on Thursday also shows the support of another NATO heavyweight. Former Prime Minister Boris Johnson was the first Western leader to visit war-torn Ukraine, and London has supplied much in terms of arms and weaponry ahead of other allies. It is a partnership that the UK is in for the long haul.
But I think fundamentally, I mean, the public support in Europe is probably not as strong as it was. I mean, lots of other issues sort of have come to the fore. But I think the main players in the Nordics, Poland, Germany, France, UK, I think the support is high.
Because the future Trump presidency may have some allies worried, there's been a flurry of more regional security and defense meetings as of late, showing that Europe is shoring up its own defenses, even if that means the U.S. may play a lesser role.
Is that sufficient commitment? In my view, not. I mean, the U.S. is clearly the big beast in the room, so making up for that commitment, I don't think is a reality. Stepping up more, yes. I guess the question is about, what nature of U.S. disengagement we're talking about.
Although Marco Rubio's statements may have stoked unease across the Atlantic, a mercurial President Trump may well now be the norm. What that means for NATO and Ukraine is that Europeans are taking more responsibility in their own hands. There are still those nations that will continue their support of Kyiv no matter what the future holds. Sasha Farbach, TVP World.
It's been 24 hours since Israel and Hamas agreed to a ceasefire and hostage release deal aiming to conclude 15 months of conflict. However, the Israeli cabinet is yet to sign off on its final details. For more on the rapidly evolving situation, let's now go live to Tel Aviv, where our correspondent Diana Skye is right now. Good evening, Diana. So what's the latest regarding the ceasefire deal?
Good evening, Maciek. While we are definitely nearing a ceasefire, this is what at this point everybody just wants now. But the reality is a little bit and actually a lot different. Now, we started off with the last signature needed on the ceasefire to actually have it take place on Sunday, the 19th of January, how it was planned, beginning at noon, was for Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu to sign off the final details. Now, the Israeli Israeli cabinet was supposed to convene this morning at 11 a.m. The meeting was then pushed. It was supposed to be pushed this afternoon. Then it was supposed to be pushed, we were told, to this evening. And the latest news that we have as of now is that the Israeli cabinet is going to intervene on Friday to approve the Gaza ceasefire agreement. Now, Israel is blaming Hamas for making last-minute demands, and of course, Hamas. Part of these demands involves the list of the Palestinian prisoners that are, and the identities that Hamas wants to know that Israel is not informing. Now, of course, Hamas says in turn that this is not true, and that they're actually blaming the current crisis due to Israel's internal political issues. I mean, we heard today far-right ministers telling Netanyahu that if he goes through with this deal, including Bezalel Smotrich, a finance minister, far-right ministers, that they're going to resign. And we all understand what that is going to mean for Netanyahu's coalition and for his government, and what kind of political turmoil that's going to create. I mean, earlier today in Jerusalem, far-right supporters and demonstrators marched towards the Israeli parliament, the Knesset, calling on Netanyahu to not sign that hostage ceasefire deal, saying that it's going to be an absolute failure for Israel and that Israel should be at war. Now, what we do know now is we're still waiting, we're speculating. Everyone thinks that it will go through. What we do know is that it's going to be a phase in three parts. The first one is going to last 42 days, where Israel would see 33 hostages in this 42 days released, 3 of them including American Israeli citizens on the first day on Sunday. Let's also be reminded a Polish-Israeli citizen is still being held hostage in the Gaza Strip. We are really hoping that each hour will give us new development as to really if finally Israel and Hamas will really agree to this and give a final end to this war.
That was Diana Skaya reporting from Tel Aviv. Thank you very much, Diana. Vietnamese Prime Minister Minh visited Poland on Thursday, marking the first visit of its kind in 15 years. While in Warsaw, he engaged in a productive meeting with Prime Minister Donald Tusk, where the discussions centered around enhancing economic cooperation. There's also some good news for Polish tourists planning to visit the Asian state. Sonia Gatabishan has more.
Thursday's visit of Vietnamese Prime Minister Minh to Poland was particularly special due to a gesture he made specifically for the occasion.
The Prime Minister initiated an important matter, a very good step from our point of view, that being the abolition of visa requirements for organized tourist groups for short-term stays.
Much of the discussions between the Vietnamese leader and Polish Prime Minister Donald Tusk focused on trade relations, as Vietnam is Poland's largest trading partner in Southeast Asia.
We appreciate the 14% increase of the bilateral two-way trade between Vietnam and Poland in 2024, amounting to $3.4 billion in absolute terms.
The importance of Polish-Vietnamese trade relations was confirmed by a member of the Vietnamese community in Poland.
It should be emphasized that in terms of production, export and import, Poland and Vietnam have a complementary or non-competitive character. Vietnam produces what Poland needs. Poland produces what Vietnam needs.
Hoang emphasized that Poland serves as a gateway for Vietnamese products and entrepreneurs into the European Union, while Vietnam similarly acts as a gateway for Polish exports to Asia. The Vietnamese community constitutes one of the largest non-European immigrant groups in Poland, making Thursday's visit particularly significant for them.
The Vietnamese Prime Minister's visit in Poland is very significant in the context of our Vietnamese community living in Poland for 40 years. Poland became a real home for the new generations of Vietnamese born here, but we also try to remember where we come from.
As part of his European tour, the Vietnamese Prime Minister will also visit the Czech Republic and participate in the World Economic Forum in Switzerland.
After 4 years of political turmoil, which included 7 elections, Bulgaria has a new government and prime minister. Headed by the centre-right Citizens for European Development of Bulgaria, the new political leadership under Rosen Zhelaskov vows to protect the rule of law and is expected to pursue a pro-Western path. Sonia Gatabishan has more.
The Bulgarian parliament has officially approved a coalition government headed by the center-right Citizens for European Development of Bulgaria, also known as the Gerb party. Rostam Zhelyaskov, a lawyer and former speaker of the parliament hailing from Gerb, was selected as the prime minister.
It is very important for us as a regularly elected cabinet to rely on parliamentary support, and that is why we have made, I would say, a serious effort to get broad parliamentary support.
The development follows many weeks of intense negotiations to establish a coalition government after the October 2024 elections, the seventh in just 4 years.
Our consultations were aimed at seeking a broader consensus, and for nearly 2 months we made great efforts to reach the necessary compromises, the necessary agreement for national responsible governance of the country. This is a success, and the formation of this government gives hope to overcome the crisis. But of course, that is not so easy, because the government has a complicated structure. This is a right-left government consisting of 3 parliamentary powers.
Aside from the center-right Gerb, the governing coalition also comprises the left-wing Bulgarian Socialist Party and the populist There is Such a People Party. Zhelyaskov emphasized that the government's key priorities for Bulgaria, an existing EU member, will include safeguarding the rule of law and facilitating a transition to the euro currency. The new prime minister is also likely to enhance international cooperation.
Zhelyaskov is known for declaring support for Ukraine, repeatedly and for some time now. Someone like him will guarantee the pro-Western, pro-Atlantic, pro-NATO character of this cabinet.
Although there may be challenges ahead for the new Bulgarian government, analysts are of the view that a new coalition is a better option than an 8th election in 4 years.
Film director David Lynch, known for his hits such as Twin Peaks and Mulholland Drive, has died at the age of 78, his family has said. A post shared on the filmmaker's Facebook page reads, "It is with deep regret that we, his family, announce the passing of the man and the artist, David Lynch. We would appreciate some privacy at this time." The cause of his death has not yet been shared but Lynch had spoken publicly about his battle with emphysema, a lung disease with no known cure due to his history of smoking. In August, the director revealed that he was diagnosed with the illness in 2020. His death comes just days before his 79th birthday. While Ukraine awaits Donald Trump's first decisions following his inauguration on January 20th, the likely new U.S. Secretary of State has shared his views on the future of the war in front of the U.S. Senate. Washington's next top diplomat is convinced both Kyiv and Moscow need to make concessions in order to reach a ceasefire. Meanwhile, Kyiv is the stage of an intense diplomatic offensive, with the British Prime Minister being just the latest Western leader to pledge more help for Ukraine over the last few days. To discuss these issues, we're joined by Yulia Osmolovska, Director of Globsec Kyiv, and Bogdan Nahailo, Editor-in-Chief of the Kyiv Post. Good evening.
Good evening.
Good evening.
So, Marco Rubio says both Russia and Ukraine need to be realistic and make concessions. So, what concessions is Kyiv ready for, given the fact that President Zelensky has repeatedly stated that Ukraine would not cede any territories? Yulia Osmolovska, please.
I would start actually from not answering the question what concessions, but rather explaining why we hear these statements right now. My assessment is that we at least hear initial assessment of the situation as it is for now from the officials, nominated officials by the Trump people. So apparently this is a strategy and the view they're going to pursue. But again, they are not all alone in this. They need to interact with both sides and to see whether both sides are really willing to negotiate and what they're ready to do as a concessions. My highest doubt is that Russia has this will to negotiate, because apparently they think that they have the upper hand right now in the situation, and definitely they're not going to withdraw from the initial demands. So I think that it's going to be a very, very long journey, and along this journey, the Americans might reassess their position. As you've seen from the initial statements of Trump, I'll finish the war in 24 hours. It's already extended to 6 months and probably even longer. So I wouldn't be sticking to what they say right now, but to interpret this as their starting position in the game.
But on the high level now, at this particular moment, let me repeat this question. Is Ukraine ready to cede any of its territory? And again, what are the Russian proposals, which Julia Osmolovska already mentioned? Because Bloomberg writes about Ukraine losing all Russian-occupied territories and becoming a neutral state with no perspectives to join NATO whatsoever.
Well, of course, the official position is that it's not, but we're in a process right now of seeing where things will end up. The Americans, too, are suggesting that this is the time for negotiation and, or rather beginning negotiation by beginning to see what both sides are prepared to settle for. The Ukrainian side has said very clearly that it is not there to give up territory after such a bloody war of 3 years and such losses, and that it wants security guarantees, which means NATO membership, EU membership, etc. But I'm a little bit more reassured by the latest statements coming out from Washington, because they're not as hardline as they were a month or 2 or 3 ago. Even the Americans, the new American foreign minister, let's call him that, Secretary of State, in his statement yesterday is saying that, you know, very clearly that Russia is in the wrong. Russia needs to be put in its place, but obviously we can't go for a zero-sum type of approach, that some kind of compromise will have to be worked out. And the message from Washington, even from Hegseth, who's going to take over the Pentagon, is saying that any compromise that's reached has to be as advantageous as possible for the Ukrainians. What this amounts to, we don't know. I mean, it's all words at the moment, and we're not sure what's going on behind the scenes.
Now, Kyiv has been hosting foreign officials for the last few days, just after German defense minister's visit. Today, we had the visit of British Prime Minister Keir Starmer to Kyiv. Now, the question is, can Europe realistically fill the gap if the US decides to cut off any substantial military help to Ukraine? Julia Osmolovska, please.
Yes, there are different assessments of that, whether Europe can 100% replace the American assistance, and none of them I've seen that's a definite yes. And the most important in this is that European capitals acknowledging this, recognizing this, and at the moment they're in very active phase to see what they can do to upgrade their capacities. Also, as far as I heard, they're considering the possibility of buying American military equipment for Ukraine. So at the moment, it's very difficult to say what is the definite position, but actually it's the process in the right direction.
Right. Now, Bogdan Mihailo, do you think that these visits are aimed to put some pressure on the new administration in Washington to let Donald Trump know that the relation of Europe and Ukraine is ironclad, and therefore force him not to abandon Kyiv? Do you think that's the goal of this diplomatic offensive in the last few days?
Well, it's not a diplomatic offensive of the last few days, let's be honest. It's a diplomatic offensive of several months, knowing that Trump was likely to win or had a good chance, and then since he's won, thinking about the implications of that. And let's remember that President Zelensky was in Warsaw yesterday, so it's not just, you know, high-ranking officials coming to Kyiv. Europe has got to get its act together, and there has to be a plan B if the worst comes to the worst and Trump goes for an isolationist policy and is more preoccupied, let's say, with Greenland or comments that he's been making about Canada even. Then obviously Europe will have to be realistic and fend more for itself. And I think with Poland at the helm of the EU, with Macron and Britain online, with several of the Scandinavian states and the others, Finland also, I think the Americans are also feeling the pressure, the new administration, that they can't simply abandon Europe and they can't abandon Ukraine. And I would say that we're seeing a subtle change in tone from the new administration to be coming from Washington. It's much more guarded than it was, more gung-ho a month ago.
Mm-hmm. Yulia Smolowska, now, how would you comment on Russian drones attacking Kyiv during Keir Starmer's visit? It's nothing new. That's something that foreign officials are now used to, I guess.
Yes, of course, and Kyiv probably is one of the most protected cities or places in Ukraine right now. So yes, it's definitely discomfort, but it's also like a sign of reminding our Western partners that they shouldn't give up and they shouldn't abandon Ukraine for this. And if you can trace different developments on different stages in war, the more resolute support from the Western partners has been coming actually after the most cruel attacks on Ukraine. Just I recall the boldest statement of the G7 under German presidency last year, I guess, not in 2023, when actually the strongest support for protection of Ukraine's critical infrastructure had been delivered. So I think that it's only in a sad way, but it only helps us to maintain this support in a way.
Right, Bogdan Hajlano, so what are Kyiv and Moscow discussing in Qatar, and can these negotiations bring an end to the conflict in Ukraine?
No, I don't think so. Let's not call them negotiations. They have nothing much to discuss at this stage. It's a zero-sum game. Ukraine doesn't want to give up territory and its sovereignty and its right to belong in the European family of nations. So it's a non-starter at the moment with Ukraine, and it's certainly not willing to discuss giving up 20% of its territory. For what? And also, let's remember, who is to pay the costs of this horrendous war? Is the EU, is America prepared to do it? If we let Russia off the hook, Russia needs to, be found as the guilty party and to pay for this. It's doing it partly by being forced to, give up its assets in the West, and already that money is coming to Europe. That's one thing, but there's also the question of war crimes. Putin is a war criminal. We've had horrendous war crimes committed, perhaps not seen since former Yugoslavia, but certainly World War II. And we're going to say what? Well, let's forget about this. Let's have a compromise. Let's have a ceasefire and pretend nothing happened. Business as usual. That's not on. And for Russia, look at what they're telling their domestic public. Read their papers. They're saying, even in the last day or two, the BBC correspondent noted today that the papers are saying there is a chance that we will restore the USSR by the end of this year. And, it's likely that Ukraine won't even exist as a state by this summer. They're feeding their own people this hype, whereas they're pretending that they're willing to negotiate at some level with the West. But also remember that key officials in Russia are saying we don't want Ukraine to be involved in these discussions. This is a deal between Russia and America. Keep others out. What are we talking about? Return to Cold War rhetoric and Kissinger type mentality that only the big states matter. So this is not good for Poland. This is not good for the Czech Republic, for Britain, for anybody else. We have to take into account what the Russians are actually doing and saying but the pretense that they have for the outside world, as if they're reasonable partners and they're realpolitik-minded and you can somehow come to terms with them.
Julia Smolowska, director of Globsec Kyiv, and Bogdan Nahailo, editor-in-chief of the Kyiv Post, were our guests this evening. Thank you very much. And thank you for watching. Adam Jasers on the record with Polish Deputy Foreign Minister Władysław Teofil Bartoszewski is coming up next.